Great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. The topic today is the morality of capitalism. And we live in interesting times. It's actually a great time to talk about the morality of capitalism, given what's going on in the markets. I'm curious, how many of you are business students? Anybody? Okay, so most of you are business students. That's good. So hopefully you're involved at least at the level of reading the Wall Street Journal or the local newspapers in terms of what's going on in the world. And what I find interesting is that what's going on in the subprime debt market with the bailout of Bear Stearns and with all the crisis in Wall Street and everything is that this has become a fantastic opportunity for the critics of capitalism to come out and attack and denounce markets. Look, they failed. Here we have Wall Street, a free market supposedly, and it's not working. We needed the federal government to come in and bail them out and help them out. And of course they come to me and say, how can you advocate for capitalism when this is the result? And I find it fascinating that almost nobody out there talks about the fact that we live in anything but a truly free market. What we have today in America, certainly what we have today in financial markets and in the housing market, is not capitalism. It's a mixture. There's some capitalism, there's some freedom in a sense, and there's a lot of government intervention and government involvement and government regulation. Just to give you some highlights. Why did we get such a run-up in housing prices here in Orange County and around in many parts of this country? Where did all that money come from? How come people could afford suddenly to buy homes in the millions of dollars and watch their homes double and in some cases triple in price? Where did all those funds come from? Well, for the longest time, the Federal Reserve held interest rates at negative real rates. They basically were paying you to borrow money. Well, guess what happens when you incentivize people to borrow money by giving them negative interest rates? They borrow money. And they borrow more money, and they borrow more money. And when they can borrow so much money and run after and bid up home prices, what happens to home prices? They go up, and you can keep getting cheaper and cheaper financing, so more and more people can get involved in this cool scam. And home prices keep going up because you can keep going to the bank, and they'll keep lending you money. Why? Because they can borrow from the Fed at really, really ridiculously low rates. 1% when inflation's at 3%. That's -2. Right? When you do your financial analysis, how often do you encounter negative interest rates? Your finance buffs don't give you problems with negative interest rates because supposedly in the real world, they're not supposed to happen. But we don't live in a market economy. We live in a place where the government can set interest rates at whatever rates they want. The Federal Reserve can set those rates wherever they want to set them. And if they decide 1% is right, that's where they're being set. And why do so many people, everybody believes today in America that home ownership is crucial. We have to all own homes. Why? Where does that come from? Well, we're incentivized to buy homes. We're incentivized to buy homes by the federal government. We get a tax deduction for the interest that we pay on our mortgage that we get in order to buy the home. We have a gazillion regulations that encourage banks to lend us money to buy homes. Indeed, the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in Congress, I think it was in the 1970s, penalizes banks if they don't lend money to low-income households. You get a rating from the Community Reinvestment, from the regulators, about how much money you lend in low-income households. So surprise, surprise. Banks were offering loans to low-income households. They were being incentivized. They get penalized if they don't. What is subprime loans? Subprime, by definition, are loans to subprime, people who can't afford these loans. Well, there's a huge incentive to do that. That the government has embodied in law. And then they talk about securitization, taking the loans and they package them and then they sell securities. Who invented that concept of securitizing mortgages and selling them out into the market? Well, again, nobody talks about this, but these were federally chartered government, pseudo-government entities called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that were created in order specifically to take low-income loans and securitize them. Why? So that more capital will flow into that market, so more subprime loans could be made. That is the primary purpose of the creation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So if you start putting all that together, and the we're in the Bush room. So Bush's ownership society, where the big emphasis was you got to own a home, you got to go out there and buy stuff. And this is something that's existed for decades. The American dream is supposedly about buying a home. And the rhetoric from Washington continuously hammering at banks about redlining, about not lending money to people who can't afford loans. You think it makes sense. You don't lend money to people who can't afford to pay it back. But politicians kept hammering away. So what did the banks do? They ultimately succumbed and started lending money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back. And we're suffering the consequences right now. But who gets blamed? Who gets blamed whenever all of this house of cards collapses, when house prices start coming down, when the Fed jacked interest rates up again to 5.25%, and suddenly people couldn't afford those mortgages they took out when interest rates were 1%, when the whole thing just comes tumbling down? Who gets blamed for that? Well, we just saw a bipartisan bill coming out of the Senate right now of saving the foreclosed homes. We're seeing Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, come out with a plan to reinvigorate the regulatory regime. We don't have enough regulation. We need more, and we need to give the regulators more power. So the regulators, in a sense, government gets a free ride. They get more power. They get more control. And it's business that gets blamed. It's those speculators, those greedy mortgage companies. It's those greedy bankers. It's those awful Wall Street types. And this happens time and time again, whether you go back to the S&L crisis or the internet bubble. It's always business that gets blamed, and it's always the solution is more regulation, more control, more government. We don't trust these guys. And yet, when you look around the world, you notice that you've got, on the one hand, Hong Kong, on the other hand, China let's say, 20 years ago, pre-1990 or pre-mid-80s. You've got Eastern Europe before the wall comes down, Eastern Europe after the wall comes down.